Welcome to my new office. Some of you probably didn't know that I moved downstairs to where the previous Beach Day office used to be. So I'm going to tell you a story that is going to help explain a favorite picture of mine. There once was a king who was as kind and wise as he was old. He only worried about one thing, and that was because he didn't have a son or a daughter who would follow in his footsteps and reign over the kingdom. He decided that he would ask his beloved people if they would choose his successor, and that he would train them until he was unable to sit on the throne any longer. But when he asked them to do that, the people said, "Oh no, King, we want you to reign forever." And of course, as I said, the king was wise and he was also realistic, so he decided to choose his successor. He decided to come up with a test. He would invite any of the men of the kingdom to come forward if they would like to be king after he was no longer able to sit on the throne. Hundreds of them came and he interviewed each one, and some of them he weeded out rather quickly because they were not likely candidates. But he narrowed it down to three men that were equally strong, handsome, and wise. They were Gildas, Sirik, and Osfrid. He had them come to his throne room, and he was reading his very favorite book. It was the Book of Wisdom. And as they entered, he said, "This is my favorite book, and in it is full of rules that will help a king and his subjects live a wise, good life." And I'm going to give you my favorite rule, and I'm going to give you a week for you to go out into the kingdom and obey that rule. At the end of the week, you will come back and I will judge who obeys it the best, who does it with great wisdom. They thought that sounded simple enough. And so he said, "This is the rule. People ought always to pray." And Gildas said, "Is that it? Is there nothing more?" And the king said, "No, just people ought always to pray." And Sirik said, "Always? Always is a long time." The king nodded, "Yes, it is." And then Osfrid said, "When do we start?" And the king says, "Now." And so the three men left, and the king continued to read from his book of wisdom. Now Gildas decided that on the hillside was a monastery, and this is where monks and an abbot lived, and they lived their life in prayer, in meditation all day long and into the night. And he thought, this is perfect. He was greeted by the abbot, who gave him a very small room where he would stay the whole week. He could pray on his knees, and they would post a monk outside his room to witness that he was praying always. Now, Sirik, on the other hand, decided to go from church to church. And in the church, he would say his prayers while he lighted candles. And he said every prayer he had ever learned. And he said it over and over. And then his mind kind of got distracted. He kept thinking, always is a long time. Always is a very long time. Sometimes he would go out on the street corner, and he would stand there in a posture of prayer, and he would start by saying Pater Noster, which is Latin, because he thought maybe that sounded more profound. By the time he ended up that week, he had lit more candles that would light the palace for an entire week. Osfrid, on the other hand, didn't seem to be obeying the rule at all. He was just going about his normal routine. in the fields and in the marketplace, and whatever he was doing was just normal. He didn't go to church any more than he normally would go. And some of the men, some of his friends said, "Osfrid, when are you going to start obeying the rule, pray always? We want you to reign over us." Osfrid said nothing. He just smiled quietly and went about his daily routine. At the end of the week, all three of them came before the king, and Gildas came forward first, and he brought the abbot with him, with a bunch of other monks, to be witness of what he had done. The abbot said, "He has been praying on his knees all week. We have brought him his meal so he wouldn't be interrupted. And even when he's sleeping, his hands were over his chest in the posture of prayer." And the king said, "Well, okay, Gildas, is anyone happier, and is the world a better place because of your prayers?" And Gildas had not thought about that, and he wasn't able to answer that question. He did not know. Sirik came forward next, and he too had brought some witnesses. The royal candle maker testified. He said, "Sirik has spent all of his money on candles as he has gone about praying in the churches." And then the royal sidewalk sweeper came forward and said, "I have seen him on street corners praying to God all week long." And the king said, "Well, Sirik, is the world a better place? Is there anyone braver and wiser because of your prayers?" And Sirik was clueless. He did not know the answer to the question either. Next was Osfrid, and he stood there by himself, and he said, "Your Highness, I have gone about my week as I normally do. For you see, so many people depend on me to help them that I just couldn't leave them to go pray in the monastery or to go and light candles and pray in the churches. But of course, as I have gone about my daily business, I always talk to God." The king leaned forward and he said, "You have talked to God while you go about your daily business? Tell me more about that." And Osfrid said, "Well, there's really not much to tell. It's just that as I go about my work, I empty my mind so that God can think through it. I am so much happier and patient and helpful when I let God think through my poor mind." And before the king could ask Osfrid the question, there was commotion outside. There were voices and knocking on the door, and the guard came forward and he said, "Your Highness, the people want to come in to tell their story about Osfrid." And the king said, "Let them come in." All of a sudden, there were men and women and children, and they were all talking at one time, telling about all these kind and helpful things that Osfrid had done that changed their lives, that bettered their lives. And the king thought, and he smiled, and he said, "And that is what the rule means. People ought always to pray." Now I have a picture at my side here. This is one of my favorites. A friend of mine made this for me many, many years ago. It is a block print, and in the center is a Hebrew word. It is avodah. And avodah is a word that means a seamless life of work, of worship, and service. And her definition of this word is cut around it. It says, worshiping, emptying oneself only to be filled with God. Emptying oneself only to be filled with God. And I think of Osfrid, how he emptied his mind so that God could think through his poor mind. And I hope that you will be able to do that too, because that is the way that you pray always.